Mary and Peter were in mourning for their late son, who had been killed in a horrible accident. Every day, they went to his tomb. Nevertheless, after about a month, they found that someone had always beaten them to it. Every day, a new rose was placed on his tomb. But who grew this rose? Peter had a solution. He put a camera to determine who it was. Yet when he saw this individual, he was taken aback. Peter and Mary were on their way home after retrieving the footage from the camera. Their bodies were filled with a mix of exhilaration and trepidation. All they had to do now was push the play button to find out who had been placing flowers on their son's tomb. But who was it that kept leaving red roses on their son's grave? Will they face this individual? Parents Mary and Peter had never healed fully from the death of their son, Michael. He was only 18 years old when he died in an automobile accident that devastated both of them. Once their son died, they didn't have much left. Their entire savings went for his funeral. Nonetheless, they never complained about it. Their son deserved a good resting site, and they promised to look after him long after he died. They paid daily visits to his grave, bringing flowers and trinkets to remember him by. This became a ritual for them, as well as a method to keep him close. But then they discovered something odd. A solitary rose lay on the headstone, and no one knew who had placed it there. They looked around, but there was no one in sight. They felt it was strange. But every time the rose withered, a new one bloomed. They got increasingly interested about who was placing these roses on Michael's grave, but there was no way to find out. So they reasoned. Then Peter came home one day with an idea. What if we hang cameras on the premises? Pointed to Michael's grave, he said to his wife. So he buys a new security camera one night and drives to the graveyard without telling his wife. He installed the camera and proudly gazed at it. Now all he had to do was wait. In his desperation to find answers, Peter decides to visit the Undertakers Office to inquire if they have any information about the person leaving the rose. He had heard that they sometimes have information about who visits the gravesites of the deceased, and he hoped that they could provide him with some information. At the Undertaker's Office, Peter explains his situation and asks if they know anything about the individual leaving the rose. The Undertaker apologizes and explains that they do not keep records of visitors to the cemetery. However, he suggests that Peter should consider talking to the caretaker of the cemetery, as they might have noticed someone leaving a rose at Michael's gravesite. Feeling somewhat deflated, Peter leaves the Undertaker's office and heads to the cemetery caretaker's office. Peter reaches the caretaker's office at the cemetery, only to find it closed and empty. Peter leaves the cemetery and seeks out a therapist, hoping to find some guidance on how to move on from his son's death. The therapist helps him understand that his obsession with the rose is a manifestation of his grief, and that he needs to focus on healing himself before he can find closure. Over the next week, Peter attends therapy sessions, joins a support group for grieving parents, and seeks solace in his faith by speaking to a priest. Despite his progress, Peter still can't help but feel a sense of curiosity and wonder about the mysterious individual who continues to leave the rose on Michael's gravesite. Since the priest was so wise, he wondered if he had any guidance on the rose mystery. He suggests that perhaps the rose is a symbol of the love that Michael had for his parents, and that it is a reminder that he is still with them in spirit. The priest also reminds Peter that there are many mysteries in life that we may never fully understand, and that it is okay to embrace the uncertainty and find meaning in our own way. He encourages Peter to continue to honor Michael's memory in his own way, and to let the mystery of the rose be a source of comfort and inspiration. On a Tuesday morning, Peter and Mary were getting ready to go for the cemetery when they received a phone call. That was the cemetery's manager. The supervisor had to confiscate the camera after someone complained about it. She saw the footage was centered on Michael's grave and connected it to Peter and Mary. Because filming without everyone's permission was against the cemetery's privacy regulation, she had to turn in the camera to the police. She made an exception for Peter and Mary because she knew them personally. She retained a copy of the footage just for them. Yet she didn't tell them what she saw in the video. She promised Mary and Peter they could pick up the tape today at the end of the day. This was fantastic news for them because they couldn't wait to find out who the mystery rose giver was for their son. So they spent the day trying to keep themselves occupied before heading to the cemetery. they could finally come by the cemetery to pick up the tape after a few hours. The cemetery supervisor, holding the USB stick, awaited them at Michael's tomb. When she handed over the USB stick, though, she murmured something Mary and Peter didn't understand, at least not yet. They brought the USB stick home, but were apprehensive to look at it. What did the cemetery lady mean when she said that to them? What if watching the clip entirely altered their memories of their son? They decided to go to bed and see how they felt in the morning. The following morning, the USB stick was still on their kitchen table. They glanced at it while eating their breakfast. "How are we going to proceed, Peter?" Mary inquired of her husband. "Does it really make sense?" "Let's watch the footage as a team," she suggested after noticing Peter's demeanor shift. He got more at ease. Yet, it would not last long. Mary sprang up and looked for her laptop. She placed it on the kitchen table and switched it on. "We got this," Peter and Mary said as they exchanged one last look. Nothing, however, could have prepared them for what they were about to witness. But when he tried to play the video, there was an error message. He tried different devices and players, but nothing seemed to work. Determined to figure out the problem, Peter went to an aid store. He explained the issue to the technician, who tried to troubleshoot the problem. Although the footage was incomplete, Peter was able to make out a few details. Peter and Mary rewatched several times to try and make out every possible detail within the frame. They looked closely to see if there was anything out of the ordinary and thought they noticed something interesting. Unfortunately, nothing out of the ordinary was captured in the footage. They noticed that the camera had a clear view of the grave, but there was no one in sight. Mary and Peter questioned if they'd made a mistake after watching for more than 5 minutes. But then, they noticed movement on the edge of the frame. A person dressed all in black approached their son's burial. They couldn't say anything about who it could be. What kind of person was it? Mary and Peter watched the scene several times to see if there were any hints hidden in the video. However, there was something familiar about the visitor. The woman was of tall stature and medium build. She looked very familiar. Finally, they discovered why they thought they recognized the woman. Since so many years had passed, Peter and Mary had no way of contacting the woman. They had no friends who could have assisted them, so their only option was to go to the cemetery and wait for her to return. Peter and Mary got up early in the morning to go to the graveyard. They didn't know if the woman had a regular schedule or if she just showed up when she felt like it. The last thing they wanted to do was miss her because they arrived late. Someone was already waiting for them when they arrived. As Peter and Mary arrived at the cemetery, they noticed that the supervisor had already visited their son's grave. She inquired as to whether they had seen the video. She looked interested in what Mary and Peter had learned about the situation. Yet the pair had their own concerns. Mary and Peter initially knew this woman from school. She was in the year above and always seemed to be snarky. The couple had the idea that this woman was just a bitter, heartless woman, at least initially. Despite the run-ins, there were times she had shown she cares also. When Peter stated that they knew who the woman was and just wanted to talk to her, to find out why she was visiting Michael's cemetery, the supervisor realized the situation was even more complicated than she had imagined. It was clear that Peter was annoyed by the woman's presence. But why? They noticed the car pull into the lot, but were unconcerned until the door opened, and a woman stepped out. Even from a distance, they recognized her. That had to be her. The woman was clutching a single rose, just as they'd seen in the video. She took her time approaching the grave and kept her head down. They stood calmly and stared at each other for a few moments. Mary finally took a step forward. The supervisor was taken aback to find her happy and even crying from delight. She addressed the woman by name, calling her No. The supervisor couldn't take his eyes off Peter and the woman's reactions. Peter took a step forward as well, reaching out his arms to the woman named No. She didn't move right away, almost as if she was considering what she should do next. But when she made up her mind, she approached Peter and reciprocated his hug. It was as though all the stress had evaporated. The supervisor felt bad for spying on such a touching moment, so she walked away from the tree and went to speak with the trio. They were all enthusiastically crying and hugging one another. It wasn't what the supervisor had expected, but it was evident that she had overlooked several important aspects. The supervisor couldn't stop herself from approaching them in order to learn more about the mysterious visitor to Michael's cemetery. Mary and Peter were perplexed as to why the supervisor was still around and why she cared enough to monitor their family's activities. Her next inquiry surprised them even more. The supervisor inquired as to who Noah was and why such secrecy was required. Mary and Peter thought her question was impolite, but Noah didn't seem to bother. After all, the supervisor had grown accustomed to seeing no. The response was nothing short of astonishing. Noah confessed that she was the daughter of Mary and Peter. The boss couldn't believe it. She'd imagined Noah wasn't related and was instead an old friend or lover. Yet after learning the reality, the supervisor was even more perplexed as to why Mary and Peter needed to spy on the tomb. Noah revealed that she fled away as a teenager and began her own life. She wasn't sure her parents would want to see her when she eventually decided to reconnect with them. Instead, she went to Michael's grave on her own. Noah had a confession to make now that they were back together. After learning of Michael's death, Noah informed her parents that she missed them and wanted to be there for them. So when they didn't recognize her immediately away at the funeral, Noah assumed it was because it had been too long. She wasn't convinced Mary and Peter actually wanted to welcome her back into the family. Peter and Mary were overjoyed to have Noah return to their lives. They'd missed her badly and wanted to make amends in any way they could. They vowed that nothing would ever come between them again, and that they would work together to commemorate Michael's memory for years to come. Noah understands the pain of grief and loss, and she offers Peter and Mary her support and guidance. She encourages them to find ways to honor Michael's memory and keep him close.